My grandmother left me a letter instead of money. My aunts laughed until I read what the letter actually said. My name is Wren Calloway, and I was 34 the afternoon. My grandmother's attorney pulled a plain white envelope from the bottom of his file and set it on the conference table in front of me. Everyone else in that room had just received something. My Aunt Patricia had received the house on Sycamore Lane. My Aunt Deborah had received the investment accounts. My cousin Tara had received the jewelry collection. My cousin Blake had received the lake property. The reading had gone around that table like a gift distribution at a holiday party. Each name called, each item announced, each recipient nodding with the careful composure of people who had been told in advance what was coming and were performing surprise for the benefit of the room. I had not been told in advance. I had driven 3 hours to sit at this table, and I had listened to every name and every item, and I had waited for mine. When the attorney reached the bottom of his list, he looked at me over his glasses, and he said, "There is one remaining item." He said my grandmother had left specific instructions that it be presented last. He slid the envelope across the table. It had my name on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. The room was very quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then my Aunt Patricia laughed, not a loud laugh. A small, contained country club laugh, the kind that communicates something without saying it directly. She covered her mouth with 2 fingers and looked at Deborah, and Deborah looked back with the specific expression of a woman sharing a joke she has been holding since before the reading began. Patricia said, "Well, a letter." Deborah said, "That's sweet." Tara looked at her phone. Blake examined his fingernails. The attorney looked at me. I looked at the envelope. I picked it up. I did not open it at that table. I want to tell you why. And I want to tell you what was inside it. But first I need to tell you who my grandmother was, and what 8 years of Sunday afternoons looked like, and why the woman who laughed at a plain white envelope had fundamentally misunderstood what my grandmother valued most in the world. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories, where the quiet ones finally get heard and the truth always arrives in the last envelope opened. If you have ever been the person a room of people underestimated, this story is for you. Drop a comment below and subscribe so the next one finds you. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Voss, and she was the kind of woman who made you feel like the most important person in the room without making anyone else feel small. That was her particular gift. She had raised 3 daughters, my mother, who died when I was 19, and my aunts Patricia and Deborah, in a house that ran on precision and warmth in equal measure. She had worked as a legal secretary for 31 years, and she understood documents the way musicians understand silence, not just the content, but the weight. She retired at 64 and spent the next 22 years doing exactly what she wanted, which was reading everything she could find, gardening with a dedication that bordered on scientific, and sitting at her kitchen table on Sunday afternoons with whoever had the time to sit with her. I had the time. I want to be honest about why. My mother died the spring of my sophomore year of college, quickly the way healthy people die when something unexpected happens, without warning or preparation or the opportunity to say the things you had been assuming you had years left to say. I came home. Not permanently. I finished my degree. But I came home differently than I had left, with the specific recalibration of a person who has understood that the people you assume will always be there are not guaranteed, and who adjusts her priorities accordingly. My grandmother was the person I came home to, not my aunts. Patricia lived 40 minutes away in a neighborhood that required a gate code and had opinions about everything, including how grief should be performed and for how long. Deborah lived an hour in the other direction and had been managing a long-running conflict with her own children that consumed most of her available emotional bandwidth. Eleanor was 20 minutes from my apartment, and she answered the phone on the second ring, and she always had coffee. I started coming on Sundays in the fall after my mother died, and I never stopped. 8 years of Sundays. Every week, except the 2 I was sick and the one time I had a work obligation I still feel guilty about. 8 years of sitting at her kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the window, and her garden shifted through its seasons outside, and she told me things about her life I had not known, and I told her things about mine I had not told anyone else. She taught me to read a contract on those Sundays, not formally, not as instruction. She would be going through her own paperwork, the maintenance agreement for the furnace, the renewal on her homeowner's insurance, the terms on a new bank account, and she would slide it across the table and say, "What does this actually mean?" And I would read it and explain it, and she would nod and ask follow-up questions until she understood every line. It became a habit. She brought me things to read. I brought her things I was working on. We talked about them the way people talk about books they have both read, with opinions and questions and the particular pleasure of 2 people who find the same things interesting. I became an estate administrator because of those Sundays, not because she told me to, because sitting at her table reading documents with her taught me that the most important papers in any person's life are the ones most people never look at carefully enough, and that looking carefully was a form of protection. She had given me a professional skill set wrapped in Sunday afternoons, and neither of us had called it that. My aunt's relationship with Eleanor was different, not distant. Present in the specific way of people who show up for the occasions that require showing up, holidays, birthdays, the appointments that carry social weight, and who maintain a warm surface that functions adequately as long as nothing beneath it is examined. Patricia called on Sundays. She did not come on Sundays. She called with the regularity of a woman meeting an obligation she had set for herself, and the calls lasted approximately 12 minutes and covered the same topics in the same order, and Eleanor would hang up and look at me across the table and say Patricia is well, and we would go back to whatever we had been discussing. Deborah visited on the 3rd weekend of every month. She brought wine and opinions and departed 4 hours later, leaving both behind. Eleanor loved her daughters. I want to be clear about that. She loved them specifically and completely in the way you love people you have raised, with full knowledge of who they are, including the parts that are difficult. She just also knew who came on Sundays. In the last 2 years of Eleanor's life, her health became the kind of project that requires management, not a single dramatic decline. The slower, more complicated kind. A succession of small things that individually were manageable and collectively added up to a life that needed more infrastructure than she could provide for herself alone. The medication schedule first. Then the driving, when her night vision became unreliable. Then the appointments, the cardiologist, the rheumatologist, the ophthalmologist who was monitoring something in her left eye that required quarterly checks. Then the house itself, which was a Victorian on Sycamore Lane that she had lived in for 40 years, and that required the kind of ongoing attention that a woman in her mid-80s with unreliable knees could no longer provide alone. I handled it, not all of it alone. She had a cleaning service and a yard crew, and I arranged and managed both, but the appointments and the medications and the grocery runs and the Sunday afternoons that had become Sunday afternoons plus Thursday mornings plus occasional Tuesday evenings when something needed addressing, those were mine. Patricia called on Sundays. 12 minutes, same topics, same order. Deborah visited on the 3rd weekend. Wine and opinions. I want to be precise about this because I am not telling you these things to build a case against my aunts as human beings. They were not absent in the way absence looks when it is cruel. They were present in the way presence looks when it is managed, contained, scheduled, sufficient for the social requirement without exceeding it. They did not drive Eleanor to appointments. They did not learn which pharmacist called back fastest. They did not sit at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening helping her understand the renewal terms on her long-term care insurance. They also, I learned at the reading, received the house and the investment accounts and the jewelry and the lake property. I received a letter. And they laughed. Eleanor died on a Wednesday morning 14 months after the Thursday evening we had spent going through the long-term care insurance renewal together. She died in her bed in the house on Sycamore Lane, with the window open the way she always kept it, and the garden visible from where she lay, and I think she would have found that acceptable. I was there. Not at the exact moment, and I had gone home the night before to sleep in my own bed because she had insisted and because she had said, "Wren, you look exhausted and go home." But I was there within the hour, and I sat with her for a while before the people who needed to be called were called. The funeral was the following Saturday. Patricia organized it with the efficiency of a woman who had been thinking about this for longer than she would say. Deborah gave the eulogy. It was well written and accurate in the broad strokes, and contained one line about Eleanor's love of gardening, and one line about her 31 years of legal work, and nothing about Sunday afternoons. I sat in the front row and held the program and let the words wash over me, and thought about the long-term care insurance renewal and the quarterly ophthalmology appointments, and the particular sound Eleanor's laugh made when I said something that surprised her. After the service, Patricia touched my arm in the receiving line and said, "Eleanor always spoke so fondly of you." I said, "I know." She said, "You were so devoted." She said it the way people say things they mean as compliments that land as something else entirely. Devoted. As if 8 years of Sundays were a form of loyalty rather than a relationship. As if I had been a caretaker rather than a granddaughter. As if the choice to come back every week had been professional rather than personal. I said thank you. I drove home. I sat in my apartment and I thought about the word devoted for a long time. The will reading was 3 weeks later in the office of Eleanor's attorney, a man named Arthur Pelham, who had handled her affairs for 20 years and who had called me personally to confirm I would be there. He had said, "There is something specific for you, and Eleanor wanted you present." I had not told my aunts he called me specifically. I had simply confirmed I would be there. The conference room had 7 chairs. Patricia and Deborah sat together on one side with their respective spouses. Tara and Blake sat at the far end. I sat alone on the other side with my folder of estate documents I had brought out of professional habit. Arthur read the will in the specific measured voice of a man who has delivered this kind of news many times and has learned that pace matters. The house on Sycamore Lane to Patricia, the investment accounts to Deborah, the jewelry collection to Tara, the lake property to Blake, various smaller bequests to longtime friends and charitable organizations, and then the pause. The specific pause of a man reaching the last item on a list that is not like the other items. He looked at me. He said Eleanor left a final item for her granddaughter, Wren. He reached into the bottom of his file. He placed the envelope on the table. My name in Eleanor's handwriting. The room was quiet. Then Patricia laughed, the small, contained laugh, covered with 2 fingers, shared with Deborah. A letter. That's sweet. I looked at the envelope. I picked it up. I did not open it. I put it in my bag. Arthur looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, professional composure over something else, something that might have been the ghost of a smile. He said there are also some accompanying documents he needed to go over with me separately. Patricia said separately. Arthur said yes. He said Eleanor had been specific that certain items be handled privately with Wren directly. Deborah said what items? Arthur said he would be in touch. Patricia looked at me. I looked at my bag where the letter was. I said, "Thank you, Arthur," and I stood up, and I left before anyone could find the next sentence. I drove to Eleanor's house. Not my apartment, her house, the one that was Patricia's now on paper, but that still had Eleanor's reading glasses on the side table, and her garden coming up outside, and the particular smell of a house that has been lived in carefully for 40 years. I let myself in with the key I had carried for 6 years. I sat at the kitchen table. I took out the envelope. If you have ever held something that you knew was going to change the shape of what you understood, if you have ever sat with an unopened envelope and felt the full weight of what might be inside it, stay with me. Subscribe so this story reaches you all the way to the end, because what Eleanor wrote in that letter is the reason I can tell you this calmly now. The letter was 4 pages, Eleanor's handwriting, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had been a legal secretary for 31 years and who understood that what you put on paper is what survives you. She had dated it 14 months before she died. She had written it alone. She had given it to Arthur with specific instructions about when and how it was to be presented. She had written my name on the envelope herself. I read it at her kitchen table while her garden came in through the window, and her reading glasses sat on the side table, and the house held its particular 40-year quiet around me. I'm going to tell you what it said. Not all of it. Some of it belongs only to me, and I intend to keep it that way. But the parts that matter for this story, I will tell you exactly. She opened by saying she knew I would not expect what was coming. She said she had made her decisions carefully and with full knowledge of how they would appear, and she wanted me to understand the reasoning before I encountered the appearance. She said the house and the accounts and the jewelry and the lake property were going to her daughters and grandchildren for a specific reason. She said she had given them what they had asked for. She had given me what I had never asked for. Then she said the line I have read so many times since that afternoon, that I could recite it with my eyes closed. She said, "The people who never ask for anything are the ones I have always trusted most with the things that matter most." She said I had never asked her for a single thing in 8 years of Sundays. She said that told her everything she needed to know about who I was. Then she told me what she had done. 14 months before she died, Eleanor had sat in Arthur Pelham's office, and she had made 2 decisions that she had not told anyone about. Not Patricia, not Deborah, not me. The first was a trust. A small, revocable trust she had established quietly, funded with an account none of her daughters knew existed, a savings account she had opened 30 years earlier in her own name alone, and had added to consistently and had never mentioned because it was hers, and she had not felt required to explain it. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary. The balance was $340,000. The second was a letter of instruction to Arthur directing him to transfer to me, upon her death, the complete contents of her personal files, every document she had accumulated in 86 years of careful living. Her legal records, her correspondence, her financial history, her journals, everything she had written down, everything she had saved, 31 years of professional documents and 40 years of personal ones. She wrote in the letter that she was leaving me her money and her records because those were the 2 things she trusted most in the world, and I was the person she trusted most with them. She wrote that the house and the accounts and the jewelry were things her daughters had wanted. She wrote that what she was leaving me was what she had valued. Then she wrote the second line I have memorized. She said, "Wren, I never once told you what Sunday afternoons meant to me because the kind of love that needs to be explained is not the kind either of us were raised to trust." I read that line 3 times at her kitchen table. Then I put the letter flat on the table, and I looked at her garden for a long time. $340,000. In a trust that had been established 14 months ago, that none of them knew existed, that would not go through the estate. That would not be subject to the will or the reading or the conference room or the laughter. That was already mine. Had been mine since Eleanor signed the trust documents 14 months ago and handed them to Arthur and crossed it off her list. She had done it the same way she did everything. Quietly. Completely. Without announcement. And she had left me a letter to explain it because she understood that I would need to understand it before I could fully receive it. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. Then I called Arthur. Arthur Pelham had been Eleanor's attorney for 20 years. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Arthur, I've read the letter." He said, "I thought you might call." I said, "The trust." He said, "Yes." I said, "She never told me." He said she was very specific that you were not to know until after the reading. I said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She wanted you to sit in that room without knowing. She said if you knew, you would not be able to sit still for it properly. She said you needed to feel the whole weight of it before you felt the relief of it." I said, "That sounds like her." He said it very much does. He said he would need me to come in on Friday to handle the trust transfer paperwork. He said it was straightforward and would take about an hour. I said I will be there. He said, "Wren." He paused. "She talked about you a great deal over the years. He said she was very proud of the person you had become." I said, "I know. I did know. But it was different hearing it from someone who had watched her say it." I thanked him, and I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table one more time. Then I drove home. I did not call my aunts that evening. I want to be honest about that choice because it was deliberate. Not from cruelty. From the understanding that what I had to tell them was going to require a room and witnesses and the specific conditions under which the truth lands cleanly, rather than getting lost in the noise of a phone call. I let 3 days pass. On the 4th day, Patricia called me. Her voice was the warm, managed version, the voice she used when she wanted information she had not been given and was approaching the gap indirectly. She said she had been thinking about me and hoping I was doing all right with everything. She said Arthur had mentioned there were some additional documents to be handled. She said she and Deborah had been wondering what those might involve. She said if there was anything they could help with as family, they were of course available. She said it all in one breath, almost, the way you say something you have been practicing. I said I appreciated that. I said I was planning to come by the house on Saturday if she was available. She said, of course. She said Deborah would be there too. I said that was perfect. I said I had some things I wanted to share with the family. She said wonderful. She said she would make lunch. Saturday morning, I drove to the house on Sycamore Lane, the house that was Patricia's now, the house that had Eleanor's reading glasses still on the side table because no one had moved them yet. I brought 2 things, the letter and the trust document, printed and tabbed, the specific legal language of a trust established 14 months ago, funded with $340,000, naming me as sole beneficiary. My colleague from work, a woman named Fiona, who handled estate transfers and who had agreed to come as a professional witness, sat in the passenger seat. We parked in the driveway of the house that had smelled like Sunday afternoons for 8 years. We went inside. Patricia had made lunch, sandwiches on the good plates. Deborah was already there, sitting at the table with her wine glass and her opinions and the particular alertness of a woman who has sensed something is coming and has prepared to receive it on her own terms. Tara was there. Blake was there. 5 of them at the table where Eleanor and I had spent 8 years of Sunday afternoons. I sat down. Fiona sat beside me. Patricia looked at Fiona the way she had looked at everything that morning, assessing, recalibrating, filing. I introduced Fiona as my colleague in estate administration. Patricia said how professional. She said it the way she had said "that's sweet" at the reading, with the small contained amusement of a woman who believed she already knew the shape of what was happening. I let her believe it. I placed the letter on the table. I placed the trust document beside it. I said I wanted to share something Eleanor had left me, and I thought the family should hear it together. Deborah looked at the trust document. Her wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Patricia looked at the trust document. Her smile stayed exactly where it was for approximately 3 seconds. Then it changed. I read the letter aloud, Not all of it. The parts that belonged only to me I kept, but the parts that explained Eleanor's reasoning, why she had made the decisions she had made, what she had valued, what she had chosen and why, those I read in the same voice I use when I present estate documents to clients. Calm, clear, every word earning its place. The room was very quiet while I read. Patricia's smile had gone somewhere. Deborah set her wineglass down. Tara stopped looking at her phone. Blake looked at the table. When I finished the letter, I placed the trust document in the center of the table. I said Eleanor established this trust 14 months before she died. I said it is funded with $340,000 from a personal savings account she maintained separately from the estate assets. I said the trust names me as the sole beneficiary. I said it does not pass through the estate and is not subject to the will. I said the transfer has already been initiated through Arthur's office and will complete on Friday. I let that sit. Patricia said there must be a mistake. I said there is no mistake. I said Arthur prepared the documents himself, and Eleanor signed them in his office with 2 witnesses 14 months ago. Deborah said we were never told about this account. I said no, you weren't. She said that doesn't seem fair. I said Eleanor thought about fairness very carefully. I said she left each of you what you had asked for. I said she left me what she valued. I placed the letter flat on the table so the last line was visible. The people who never ask for anything are the ones I have always trusted most with the things that matter most. Patricia read it. She read it twice. Then she looked up at me and I watched something move across her face that I had not expected. Not anger, recognition, the specific expression of a woman who has just understood something about her own mother that reframes 40 years of Sunday phone calls. She said, "Mother kept track of everything." I said yes. She said she always did. I said yes. Patricia looked at the letter in my hand, her mother's handwriting, careful and deliberate, 14 months old, and she said something I will carry for a long time. She said I should have come on Sundays. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that Eleanor had not already said in 4 pages of careful handwriting. The room was quiet. Fiona was writing something in her notepad. Deborah was looking at her wine glass. Tara was looking at nothing in particular. Blake had his jaw set in the specific way of a man who wants to say something and has understood there is nothing useful to say. I gathered the documents. I put them in my folder. I stood up. I said I was sorry for the loss of her. I meant it completely. Eleanor had been theirs too. In different ways and to different depths, but theirs nonetheless. I said I hoped we could find a way to honor her memory together, even if the reading had not gone the way anyone expected. Patricia looked at the table. She said yes. She said she hoped so too. I walked out of the house on Sycamore Lane for the last time as a visitor. The trust transferred on Friday. $340,000. Clean and complete and documented in the specific bulletproof way of a woman who had been a legal secretary for 31 years and who had handed the paperwork to an attorney she trusted 20 years before she needed him. Eleanor had prepared everything. She had understood her window and used it. She had addressed the failure mode before it arrived. She had left me a letter to explain it because she knew I would need the explanation before I could fully receive the gift. I want to tell you what I did with the money. Not because the amount is the point, it was never the point, but because what you do with something tells you what it meant to you, and I think what I did tells you what Eleanor meant to me more clearly than anything else I could say. I bought a house. A Victorian on a quiet street with a garden in the back that needed attention, and bones that were excellent. I moved in on a Sunday. I sat at the kitchen table that first Sunday afternoon, and I made coffee, and I looked at the garden through the window, and I felt the particular specific weight of being somewhere that was mine, completely, undeniably documented and recorded and bulletproof mine. And underneath the weight something that was not quite peace, but was the closest thing to it I had felt. Since the Wednesday morning Eleanor died, I brought her reading glasses. They are on my side table now. I look at them on Sunday mornings. Patricia called me 2 months after the transfer. She said she wanted to come by, not to negotiate, not to revisit anything. She said she had some of Eleanor's things she thought I might want. She came on a Sunday afternoon. She brought a box. Inside it was the green ledger Eleanor had kept her household accounts in for 40 years, and the specific edition of the dictionary Eleanor had kept beside her reading chair, and a photograph I had never seen. Eleanor and my mother, young, laughing at something outside the frame. Patricia set the box on my kitchen table. She looked around my kitchen. She said, "It looks like her house a little." I said, "I think that was accidental." She said she did not think it was accidental. She looked at the reading glasses on my side table. She said she should have come on Sundays. She said it again, quieter this time, not to me, to herself or to Eleanor. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She told me things about Eleanor I had not known from before my mother died, from before any of us were part of the story. I told her things about Sunday afternoons. We did not become close that afternoon, but we became honest. And honesty is where everything real begins. Eleanor left me a letter instead of money. She left me both. But she made sure I understood that the letter was the real inheritance and the money was the proof of the letter, the proof that she had meant it, that the Sunday afternoons had been the most valuable hours of her week, that the person who never asked for anything had been trusted with the things that mattered most. She was right that I would not have been able to sit still at that reading if I had known. She was right that I needed to feel the full weight of it before I felt the relief. She was right about everything she was always right about, which is why I went on Sundays, which is why I am still going in the ways that remain available to me. At the kitchen table of my own house now, with her reading glasses on the side table and her ledger in the drawer and her photograph on the wall and her garden in the back that needed attention and has been getting it every week without fail. She never stopped teaching me. She just changed the medium. That is my story. 1 plain white envelope, 4 pages of careful handwriting, and a room full of people who laughed at a letter until they understood what letters can contain. If someone in your life shows up without being asked and stays without needing a reason, tell them what that means. Do not wait for the letter, and if you have been the one showing up, know that the people worth showing up for are keeping track even when they never say so, especially when they never say so. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me which line from Eleanor's letter stayed with you. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.